We're talking about two kind of areas. The commonality between them really is just that I'm excited about them and doing them. So talking about Pacific Fibre, which you may have heard a bit about, and also talk about my adventures in philanthropy and how I'm thinking about that. So let's start with Pacific Fibre. So this was a sort of serendipitous conversation that I had with David Cunliffe, who was the then Minister of Information Technology, I believe. And I was saying to him, you know, this fibre to the home thing is not what matters. And the reason why that is not what matters is because 90% of all of the traffic that that New Zealand consumes is off servers that are hosted overseas and in the US. The other 10% is, you know, servers that are hosted here, like the TradeMe servers and local bits and pieces. But most of your email goes overseas before it goes to your neighbour, and all the things you look at, YouTube and so forth. So the conversation was, well, if you're going to do fibre to the home, that only actually gets people to Auckland. You haven't actually solved anything in terms of the economics around internet connectivity. And he said, well, why don't you go and do it, this international fibre thing? And I said, well, okay then. So that's how we kind of ended up into it. So I was just going to talk a little bit about why we've landed there and why most things I do are pretty logical and pretty well thought through, and this gives you the thinking. So currently New Zealand is connected to the world through the Southern Cross cable, which is a cable which is owned by Telecom, 50%. Telecom, bear in mind, is a foreign-owned company in New Zealand, and owned by Verizon and Optus, two other foreign companies. So our entire connectivity to the rest of the world is provided from an internet perspective, and I'm not going to go into too much about why that's important or how much of our future will depend on that. But our entire future is based on a foreign-owned company connecting New Zealand with a cable. It's a great cable, and they're doing a good job. But the fundamental problem we have with it is not the speed of the cable or the performance of the cable, it's the fact that that they are a monopoly. And monopolies are horrible things until you own one, I discovered. So putting some numbers on this, taking a unit of bandwidth, a 10 gigabit pipe from New Zealand to the United States, ISPs buy that for about $16 million. So they buy an allowance of pipe, $16 million. They then try and get as many internet customers as they possibly can, and apportion that across as wide a base as possible. So the economics of internet service providers, who we all spend our money with, is that their job is to get as many people as they can paying $50 a month, and buy as little as possible of international bandwidth, because it's an extremely expensive and scarce resource. Priced for scarcity. It's not scarce. The technology allows it to be kind of infinite. In Japan, for the cables that didn't get affected by the tsunami, the connectivity from Japan to the United States for the same unit is $400,000. Now, there's less people in this part of the world, but other numbers that you triangulate on is that the dividend from Southern Cross last year was around $200 million. It's going to cost us $400 to do a cable. So when you think about those sort of numbers, it just makes no sense to not do it when one's building up the business case. So the fibre to the home project is, if we think about it like this, you've effectively got copper to the home at the top. National backhaul is pretty good, connecting people to Auckland, and then international. And what the government's going to do is they're going to pour lots and lots of money to make it really, really fast to connect to Levin, Tauranga, Auckland. YouTube is unlikely to be, or Google is unlikely to move their hosting centre to Levin or Tauranga or any of these places. The way that manifests to us at the moment is through data caps. So rather than saying, rather than pricing you on as much as you eat, they basically say, well, you've got a data cap. No one understands what megabytes are or megabits. They're different. The way that they constrain it is with data caps, and they basically manage that resource across all of those people. So our cable is very simple. You basically start in Sydney because that's actually where all the money is. New Zealand's a small part of the economical equation for the cable. Southern Cross is only around 20% of their businesses, from New Zealand, just it's a population thing. And it's pretty easy when you look into it in some detail. There are companies all around the world with these ships. Venezuela just threw a cable across to Cuba and connected Cuba, to the internet with a great cable. If Venezuela can do it, then surely we must be able to do it. So if we look at the curves, more people are getting onto broadband. That's great. But what's really changed is the inflection point in the consumption of bandwidth. So people have moved from emails and all these other things to an insatiable appetite for video, and it's not like a fixed it's not like a buffet where you're eating food and you get full. It's like a virtual buffet in a virtual world where you can eat buildings. So you just kind of, if the video is really, like I Skype my kids regularly because I'm away from home quite a lot, and there's a config file on my computer that I can change, and it does automatically actually change based on bandwidth that's available. If the bandwidth's available, the video upscales and it takes the bandwidth. That's how it works. So demand is actually infinite. So it's more a case of what is driving these things. So at the moment we've got YouTube driving about 10%, Facebook driving 17%, Skype video, which will be coming in your internet-connected televisions. It already is actually, but it'll be more common that we have that. Services are pushing into the cloud, so it's unlikely that 10, 20, the life of a cable is 25 years. So 25 years from now, it's unlikely that you are going to be installing huge DVDs full of Microsoft Office onto your computer. It's quite unlikely. 28 million iPads are shipping this year. My Xbox is connected to the internet. My Sky decoder has the capacity to be connected to the internet. One of the big issues that is driving this is you're seeing a decoupling from content providers and pipe owners. So there's two, I read yesterday actually, I'm a director of Fairfax Media, which owns all the newspapers in New Zealand and all the websites now. The two worst industries to be in at the moment is, second is newspapers, in terms of its long-term growth outlook or medium-term growth outlook, and the worst one is fixed-line telephone providers. So these are terrible businesses where you've got the people who typically own the pipes own the content, and they sell you that they have a monopoly into your home, and so they can sell you the content at whatever price. That's decoupling. The content is at Netflix and at Google and at YouTube and so forth, and the pipes are owned by these structurally challenged organisations that, in the same way with Trade Me, all I was trying to do is turn their $1 billion business into a $10 million business, and in the process make it mine. And with the telecommunications business, it's the same. You basically have these huge businesses. The international pipe, they're talking about it in Australia, right? Because our market's Australia and New Zealand, spending $40 billion on fibre to the home. The international component's $400 million. So for those of you that don't deal with millions and billions, it's 400 million that's 100 times more to connect the home than it is to deal with what they actually are consuming, which is the international part. So all these international things that we're all doing, mobile, big driver as well. Ultimately, it's reasonably easy. Basically, get some customers. It's like doing an apartment building. You basically get some customers. Off the back of customers, you get finance, and off the finance, you just phone up Alcatel or one of the big providers and say, get going and do a cable. So you can do it all from your desk, effectively. So that's Pacific Fibre. I'll talk a bit about philanthropy. They're not natural bedfellows, I know, but anyway. So I've actually just got back from East Africa last week, or maybe the week before. I'm a bit confused. But this is basically what philanthropy looks like at the moment. So the Super Bowl has two teams. One will win. There are 100,000 T-shirts sitting at the stands outside of the stadium when everyone walks out. They want to be able to sell T-shirts to the winning team. There are 100,000 T-shirts which are invalid, and so World Vision takes them and puts them into villages in Mali or Malawi or one of these places. And so if you go to these places, you find these people wandering around with these T-shirts. And obviously there's very little in the way of textile or T-shirt businesses in the places where these are dumped. So, you know, it's complete nonsense. So my sort of starting position is that most of this stuff doesn't work. And the more and more I get into it, and the more I spend time with people who have spent their lives in here, that is basically the case. Now there's a difference between aid, which is throwing rice out of helicopters to people who need it, or else they'll starve, and development. They're different. So I'm talking about development. So my investment model for that is really focused on three things. One is the model. The model has to kick ass. The team has to kick ass, and they have to have some evidence that they've got some momentum. So when you're looking at a model, you're really looking at, is what they're doing actually working? So not, did you successfully build a school? The question is, did you successfully educate some children? It's very, very rare that people go to that level of analysis when they're giving money. Is it cost effective? What does it cost to educate a child? So Madonna was in the paper just a couple of days ago. She spent $15 million in Malawi to build a school for girls. She spent her $15 million and she hasn't built a school for girls or otherwise. So that's an example of it's a difficult sum to do because the denominator is zero, but you know, when you're looking at these interventions, there are reasonably, it's relatively crude, but if you're looking at saving a mother's life in childbirth at scale, then you can look at the way that an organisation does that, and you can look at how many people they do that effectively for, make the case and understand the evidence, and understand the cost to do that. The cost to do that's about $300 or $400 in developing countries. So if you can find someone that's delivering at $200, $300, $400 to save a mother in childbirth, that's pretty good. If they're spending $4,000 to do that, you know, you just ask the questions of, well, why are you spending $4,000 and not $400, and understand it in more detail. Is the change sustained? So often you go in and you do, you know, I guess the best example of sustained change would be Christianity or any other religious kind of missionary work. You know, they've obviously had tremendous sustained impacts and with their change. Most changes don't sustain. So you go in and you look at a water pump that has been put into a village. Half of them are not working after 6 months, and there's no system of maintenance for these things. There's no entrepreneur who is motivated to do it. It's all community ownership. So community ownership doesn't work in developed countries in terms of driving economic growth or sustained change, and it doesn't work either in developing countries. For some reason we think it does. And is it designed for systemic scale? So I'm not really interested if you're building a school. I'm interested if you're building a school a day. So that needs to be the aspiration, because there's just far too many people who are in the category where I work, which is in the extreme poor of 1 to 1.5 billion people, earning less than sort of $300 a year, or $1 a day. There's just too many of them to do it one school at a time. So I thought I'd just step you through quickly an example of something that I've got a portfolio of 12, 15 of these organisations that I have found that have been pretty hard to find. So here's an example of one. So the big problem is 80% of the world's poorest people are subsistence farmers. So you go, you drive around East Africa, everyone's basically a farmer. 80% of the poorest people in the world are also subsistence farmers. 15%, there's lots of indicators, but 15% of their kids die before the age of 5. And this is usually my test when I go into a village. If they haven't seen balloons before, then you're working in the right place. So you give them a balloon, leave it with them for 10 minutes, and if they are still looking at it and don't know what to do with it, then you're in the right place. If they've seen balloons before, then then they're usually outside of the bottom billion, so a little bit up. It's very simple to solve what they're trying to do, which is help people grow more food. So you teach people how to space seeds properly, you teach them how to apply fertilizer properly, you give them the seeds and inputs at the time when they need to plant. It rains, it's rain-fed agriculture. Rain-fed agriculture is very important to plant at the right time. Families that earn that sort of level of money have been hungry for quite a few months. They have no money, so they can't actually do the inputs. So you extend them some credit, some inputs and some training and teach them how to do that. They grow 3 times more food. It's really simple. It's really predictable. You go in, you grow 3 times more food. They have a 98% repayment rate on the on the credit which is extended to them in the form of seeds and fertiliser. And the internal metrics of the organisation are improving as economies of scale kick in. So you have 72, it started at start-up kind of phase, numbers of farmers that you're serving. You've got, it costs you $600 to $700 to reach each farmer, but that's now down at about $70 a farmer. So you take a family out of poverty for $70. That's a pretty good number. And you're scaling your numbers. So you go from start-up 2,000 to they're currently at about 70,000, this organisation, and next year they'll be at 150,000. Their 5-year plans to be at 1 million. So you're kind of not mucking around at the edges. You're kind of trying to actually do things at scale. So again, proven impacts. They do halve infant mortality. They do make sure people aren't hungry, and they do double their incomes. It's cost effective. $70 a family out of poverty is pretty good. That's fully taken the charge of the organisation. It's not kind of doing funny accounting about what's administrative and what's not. Is the change sustained? They've been going for a few years. The evidence would suggest it is, but they do need to stay there in order to keep providing the inputs, and they're systematically going for scale. So this is an example of something which is just down the road, which is another big problem in these areas is actually storage of grain and storage of their outputs. So this is a big UN project. It's multi-million-dollar grain silos. It's literally within sight of the farmers where we were standing there for that bloom photo, and it's never been used. When you've got half an acre, a subsistence farmer, you actually don't need massive US-style grain silos. It just makes no sense. So they do lose their crop. They do lose it to bugs and so forth through storage, 50% of it. But you're helping them grow 3 times more, so that's kind of the next stage to solve. A couple of thoughts about strategy for New Zealand. So I guess what I try to do and the things I'm doing is really just, I don't really consider myself too much to be a thinker about the very long term. I tend to be a bit of a black swan sort of kind of guy where I kind of think that shit happens and then you've got to adapt. And so what I sort of think about is focusing on bright spots. So I look for people I look for talent, and I look for models, and I look for people who have evidence of success, and I try and invest behind that. And it doesn't really matter where that is, whether it's in philanthropy or a for-profit investing. I'm sort of split across both. So I guess one of the things I'd encourage, out of this, when we're thinking about what the future looks like, the question is really, what are the bright spots? Paul Callahan's talk was good in that regard, showing us some of where those bright spots are. That doesn't necessarily mean you see Fisher & Paykel healthcare and our entire national strategy is in sleep apnea devices. But there are lessons out of that around how to make those things work. We need to think about talent and where they want to live. The people who are working for Weta, the people who have enough money, they can just leave. So if it's no good, they'll just leave. And I was down in Queenstown yesterday with a tech billionaire guy, looking around Queenstown, and he's thinking maybe we'll just leave the US. He's got his own kind of weird reasons for doing that. But the talent, and there are 30,000 people in the world with over $100 million. So it doesn't take too many of them to get down to New Zealand to invest off the back of what we do have to actually drive that. And I know there's a big gap between our understanding or between the attitudes of income inequality. To me, it's more about providing a base level and above for the bottom. It's not about, I'm quite happy to have lots of billionaires here if it moves our Gini index. It's not that's not the problem. The problem is we should be focusing at the bottom and not worried about the top dragging up, creating disparity between the top and the bottom, because it immediately drives us into mediocrity and having us all being average. And we can all earn 40 grand a year. It's like, well, that'll be a great world. And the other thing is to connect. It's really important that we connect outwards. Weta's doing a fantastic job of that in New Zealand, bringing people in for immersive experiences working here. And we're trying to do our job in the tech community as well, reaching out, because the people who really know what's going on in tech and have the money to invest in technology and so forth are they're spread around the world, and we're 0.5% of that world. So we do need to connect and get out and do that effectively. Thanks very much.